Christoph, thank you for the invitation. This has been an amazing few days. I'm very, very happy to be here and very happy to talk to you about Goethe and some of my research. So, as mentioned, my topic is on the challenge that Goethe faces and many of us face in representing metamorphosis, the way that living beings and other processes in nature change through time. And this is more or less the trajectory of my talk for today. We're going to start by focusing in on kind of metamorphosis and, in a way, the changes that are present in nature, and how Goethe reckons with and kind of creates methods for understanding and cognizing those changes in life, specifically, in particular, how he faces the changes in organismal form. After kind of looking at that for a little while and rehearsing some of the things that we've already touched on in some other talks like Matt's, we're going to look at the challenges that Goethe faces in representing life. So representing these changes, how does he talk about them? How does he visualize them? How does he, reckon with the challenges of squaring a processual creature or organism or process with static representations or drawings or things like that. So we're going to look at that for the second point. We're going to look at what he sees as inadequacies of these, how he tries to write about or write motion. And then we'll look also at time forms, this notion of a time form and how that might be helpful in understanding and representing metamorphoses. And then we're going to look a little bit into, I've just kind of occluded it, hoarded it so that no one really knows where we're going. But we're going to look at a really interesting next step, a historical kind of curiosity around the time of Goethe's death about technological innovations that might actually allow us to represent visually the changes of organisms in a new way, a new exciting way that many of us kind of take for granted today. So without any further ado, we're going to move and look at nature's dynamism and the science of morphology. So here we have depicted, in the largest scale, Goethe there. That's Schelling in the back, looking off to the left, and Herder looking to camera. These are in a way, the protagonists of my book. They're the three figures that I looked at, who I claim kind of develop something of, not a totally coherent research program like Dan was talking about with the organicists at the beginning of the 20th century. But all of these folks knew each other, worked with each other, read each other's work, contributed to each other's thought on life and how it ought to be philosophized and thought of. And so I've kind of classified them as metamorphic organicists, and we can get into why I do that later, and we can have quibbles historically or otherwise about the title. But I want to start with kind of their shared fundamental presupposition, which is this notion of nature as active productivity. So all three of them share a kind of common, either depending on how you want to frame it, a misinterpretation of Spinoza or a creative reinterpretation of Spinoza's notion of natura naturans. So this idea of nature naturing, right? Nature in the act of production, as opposed to natura naturata, right? So which is the product of nature. So this kind of similar distinction that Dahlia was drawing out earlier, that Schelling plays with, this preference for and foregrounding of the processual nature of nature. So what we see a recognition of, especially in this time, is not only kind of the vast diversity of organismal form, the kind of expansion, the explosion of natural history at this time, recognizing and learning about new creatures, but also, new appreciations for the depth of geological time and the, debates around things like volcanism and Neptunism and the creation of certain rocks, right? So we have the beauties of different kinds of forms of life, the activity of other forms. So we see this kind of omnipresence of action, potential, and productivity, everywhere in nature. And if we're going to foreground that, and if we're going to prefer it in a way, or argue for its primacy over the products of nature, then we have to maybe start, do we have to start thinking differently about nature? And do we have to start thinking about differently about how we approach nature, a nature that is in process? So here's just a few, examples of some texts where this notion of nature as active productivity are played with many, especially in Schelling, his first outline for a system of Naturphilosophie, on the world soul as well, which Goethe read very early on, and Herder also plays with the idea in his ideas for the philosophy of the history of humanity as well. So as a kind of premise, a kind of something that all three of these figures share is this, is a agreement that nature is fundamentally productive, and we ought to think about nature as processual. And so really, Goethe's science of morphology, which he defines, and I'll walk through these in a moment, is a reckoning with and an attempt to create a science that takes seriously the fact that nature is fundamentally a process, right? So the science of morphology, he says, is maybe said to include the principles of form, Gestalt, so the kind of static form, the shapes of the things around us, the actual physiognomy in a way, as well as the transformation of that form. So it's, I think, just important to kind of alight on the fact that morphology, especially in its original instantiation, when Goethe coins the term and begins to actually create this notion of a morphology, it's never just about creation, the study of or comparison of static forms or adult forms of life. It's not merely a comparative anatomy. It's always, from the very beginning, already also a study of the transformation of forms. So we're not just looking at kind of like comparing animals across the animal kingdom or something like that. That's part of it, but it's never only that. It's always kind of embedded in this notion also of not only of organisms being processual, but also nature being processual fundamentally. Um, and kind of reiterating this and kind of in his description of the science, when we look at all these Gestalten, especially the organic ones, we find that nothing in them is permanent, nothing is at rest or defined. Everything is in a flux of continual motion. This is why German, and so he's actually talking about the German words that he's using to clarify. This is why German frequently and famously makes use of the word Bildung, which I would translate here as formation, to describe the end product and what is in the product of production as well. He sees that word Bildung as just having a multivalence that's a lot more helpful in describing if we're gonna land on a word for form in for morphology, Goethe is pointing us towards Bildung as the right one, because it has that kind of multivalence and that openness to motion and movement, and not the stasis that can often be ascribed to the conversations around the word Gestalt. So we see here, of course, echoes of that, similar conversations that are happening even now in kind of a re-reckoning with process philosophy. Dan and John Dupre's book, Everything Flows, is just an example of that. But, science, when confronted with this fact, has to reckon with how it might do science differently. So another kind of fundamental principle, I guess, that really starts to inform Goethe's understanding of how we ought to approach nature and organisms in nature is something that, I mean, he says something similar to this, but what I'm just going to kind of call and identify an epistemic impatience, a kind of like, in a way, a fault of human nature, um, that that he thinks we really need to address and recognize before we can adequately study and understand nature. So he has this great quote from a little snippet entitled "The General Observation." He says, "We can hardly resist the thought that what led us to a phenomenon is also the origin, the cause of the phenomenon. So the first thing that we see, we think, oh, well, there it is, I've got it. We then persist in this belief instead of taking the opposite approach and putting our first opinion to the test in order to gain the whole, more fulsome concept." What would we say of the architect who entered a palace by the side door and then tried to relate everything in his description and drawings to the minor aspect he encountered first? Yet in the sciences, this happens every day. So this is a kind of, critical self-reflection on the history of science. And he says, so often scientists discover something brand new and create an entire system kind of around and from that perspective. And he says, this is something that we ought to take seriously. It is in a way, a vice of science. He also associates this is a word that he develops and uses a little bit later in his works, velociferisch, which is this combination of velocità, right? So just speed, and luciferisch, which is like demonic, right? Like devilish. And so he combines these two words and comes up this kind of neologism to describe not only kind of the um, the pace of society that outstrips kind of our understanding, so like a technological advance, but also just our capacity to rush to conclusions, to go beyond what it is in a way that we're ready to concretely and confidently conclude. And I would also connect this same kind of notion that Goethe plays with, which we will explore a little bit in some of the next few slides, with what myself and Dennis and our colleague Rasmus Winter call illicit or pernicious reification. This notion, if we want to use the map analogy, of the fact that very often we get so comfortable with the maps that we use that we start to forget that they're maps and start to confuse them for the world itself. We, in a way, have to create an ontology in which we get lost to use a map, but we get trapped in it. We conflate the map with the world. So that's his most recent, but when maps become the world, which is an enormous help to me in navigating these ideas in my own work. And for now, we're actually just going to skip that. We could talk about that later. So what does this method then look like that Goethe develops for encountering a world in motion, really? And there he calls it a tender empiricism, zarte Empirie. Sorry? Yeah, there's a few different translations of it, but delicate, ginger, I've heard, tender empiricism. So the fundamental method that seems to be reiterated and is very well developed in his relatively early scientific text, Experiment as Mediator between Object and Subject, is what I would translate as the genealogical method. It's genetische, actually, in the German, but then you start talking about a genetic method and then people start to get confused. So especially when you're talking to contemporary philosophers of biology. So what would the genealogical method be? Well, let's say you encounter this little creature on the side of the road. How do you know what kind of a bird this is? In a way, the best way that Goethe says that you need to understand what kind of a bird this is to watch it through its life stages and its transformations. You can recognize this adolescent blue jay by actually seeing what it grows into, and also by watching it from the development of its egg to reproductive maturity and the creation of new eggs, and watching this cycle over and over again, becoming familiar with the entire series of transformations of a blue jay in the course of its life, gives you a way of and of encountering and understanding what kind of bird that is and what part of the life cycle it belongs to. And so this genealogical method that Goethe and Herder, in a way, develop. Goethe is inspired by the way that Herder writes about a very similar methodology. So they can be said to have developed it in tandem in a way. But the whole point is that in observing an organism in its development through time and potentially, and well, I'll get there, but observing many such organisms in their development through time, what one is able to kind of intuit is not just in a way, the gestalt of the adolescent blue jay, but the full form, in a way, the Bildung, right, of the blue jay. That, and by cognizing this, by taking this in and by representing it to oneself in one's own imagination, one is able to when encountering any of these other gestalten, to be able to put them into the context of that time form and to understand the significance of that particular gestalt that one might encounter in one's everyday life. The phrase time form is, I think, coined by Ron Brady, who I think was very associated with the Nature Institute, if I'm not mistaken, Craig. And the encouragement in this genealogical method to spend time and carefully observe these organisms. Joan develops in an early paper comparing, not just artistic appraisal, but artistic production, and Goethe's experiences of that in Italy and in Weimar, this is in a way a means of producing a subjectivity in scientists, right? An active form of changing one's habits in a way that we can see the world in a different way. And so by, creating a disciplined, habitual means of watching these forms develop through time in an ordered sequence, one then awakens in oneself the capacity to see, to recognize these time forms in nature. Goethe says, if I look at the created object or inquire into its creation and follow this process back as far as I can, I will find a series of steps. Since these are not actually seen together before me, I must visualize them in my memory so that they can form a certain ideal whole. At first, I will tend to think in terms of steps, but nature leaves no gaps, he says. And thus, in the end, I will have to see this progression of uninterrupted activity as a whole. So by watching the serial set of developments happen, one can eventually kind of co-construct in one's imagination a time form of, in this case, a particular organism. Now, it doesn't, this is in a way the fundamentals of the method, right? This kind of serial, patient observation of in this case in particular, organic development. But Goethe has a wonderful kind of development of this to kind of explain how one, in applying and reapplying the genealogical method, one can refine those phenomena that one has in one's mind. So in a way, those first few passes at the blue jay would be considered something like the empirical phenomenon. It's not just seeing a bird for the first time or something like that. It still requires this kind of like actual time, patience to better understand the life form of a particular organism in this case. But then we see in kind of reapplying and applying again recursively on top of the phenomenon that one already has intuited, the development of what Goethe calls the scientific phenomenon. Now here he says that, so this is grasped as, right, the empirical phenomenon that one has grasped is subject to further elaboration via experimentation and input from the scientific community. His notion of the scientific phenomenon is not just, that that one can, in a way, vary that series, through experimentation, through changing different kind of parameters of the observation to see what would happen to the plant if I change the light source or tweak the soil, or something like that. And then one then builds out in a way a more comprehensive, more nuanced, more complex inner representation of what that plant is and what its potentialities are, because one has experienced how those things can change. But it also requires this kind of, Goethe talks about the fact that he ends up reading more scientific papers, and those interactions, those observations that he hears about, also begin to inform and change and correct the empirical phenomenon that he's already, constructed for himself, co-constructed for himself. And he says that this is, in a way, again, a protection against this kind of epistemic impatience, right? It's keeping those it's being willing to be corrected, not only by nature itself, but by the other observers who are doing similar kind of work. And only after, oh, and sorry, yes, of course, this also touches on the fact that Goethe was conversant and reading, the kinds of works that are happening at this time. He knows Kielmeyer, he's read Blumenbach, and not to say that he understands it all the exact same ways that they would want it to be understood, but he's very much, well, perhaps a dilettante, very much part of the conversations that are happening at the time. So this, this is just evidence that, at least for him, this literature was incredibly helpful in his understanding. And in a way, only after that, and on top of that, do you get this notion of the pure phenomenon, the kind of either the Urpflanze, the Urphänomen, the archetypal phenomenon, which is again a kind of like the last. It's like taking all of these things together in even more time and even more reflection to really kind of come up with those fundamental principles, in a way, what Goethe does call laws, but these kinds of fundamental principles that shape not necessarily just the singular form or set of Bildungen that one's looking at, but also perhaps like entire genuses of organic form or something like that. It's only after, looking across an entire genus or, something like that, that one can have come up with these kind of more generalized laws of form and formation. And only after, again, having also consulted one's colleagues and things like that. So once one gets to that level, even this kind of pure phenomenon, it's not alighting on some singular form, not a gestalt that someone's saying like, that's it, that's the form that explains everything else. It's always this Bildung. It's always something that's kind of still temporally stretched, can move backwards and forwards in time. It's not a simple gestalt that we're talking about for a pure phenomenon. And so what we result in a way, is kind of a synchronization. Goethe says, when something has acquired a form, it metamorphoses immediately to a new one. If we wish to arrive at some living perception of nature, we must ourselves remain as quick and flexible as nature and follow the example she gives. So the scientist, in a way, by applying this method and this disciplinary kind of act to oneself, the scientist, again, creates this capacity to react to and to change one's understanding in the way that, in this case, the organisms demand that the understanding be changed. So in a way, a kind of summary, spending time with metamorphic beings is necessary to cognize them for Goethe. So one has to spend time with temporal beings. The genealogical method corrects and mitigates that epistemic impatience that I identify and that Goethe identifies. These pure phenomena that Goethe talks about require more time and more diverse perspectives, in a way, a richer set of kind of not just empirical, but just of data, right? And participatory data as well. And with practice, scientists can match those differing rhythms that they encounter in nature, improvise, and in a way dance in step, right? To match that rhythm and to be able to move in the ways that nature demands that they also move. So the genealogical method trains the investigator, cultivating the virtue of epistemic patience against epistemic impatience. And kind of the main quote I think that he finishes experiment as mediator between object and subject with, if imagination and wit sometimes run impatiently ahead on the path of making these connections, the method itself will fix the bounds to which they must return. So by abiding by this method, it kind of gives you the space within which to appropriately play as a scientist and to speculate and to hypothesize as a scientist. Um, and so we have here too some examples of where these notions of, the empiricism of the time, it's often a contested space in a way. For a very long period of history, at least the 20th century, the Romantics were just kind of dismissed as being non-empirical, purely speculative. But work like Dahlia's, work like Emanuel Goldstein's, which looks very carefully at these kinds of like the methods that are used by these scientists, kind of reintroduces this notion of empiricism and the specific kind that the Romantics used. So cognizing metamorphic organisms then. So again, we have the syncing of the productivity of the mind and the organism. So again, if we were to look at, kind of following the blue jay through its many transformations, and we were also then to look at the transformations of a robin, say, and a robin, an North American robin's life cycle. And then we were to do that over and over again for a bunch of different birds, right? What ends up happening for how Goethe describes it is that we in a way participate in through imagination and through our perception, the actual productive activity of those animals in their life cycles. So Schelling believed that investigators could participate in nature's own production of phenomena and thus intuit those metaphysical conditions, the very principles and powers that nature itself employs in its active production of its products. Indeed, once intuited, those principles could then be applied and thrown back onto nature in the form of predictions and hypotheses to be tested via experimentation. So as one could say one develops a feeling for how the organism is and how it develops, a la Barbara McClintock up there in the upper right-hand corner. So in a way, this is kind of like my attempt at kind of trying to come up with a number of kind of universal principles from this group of Goethe, Schelling, and Herder of kind of fundamental features of the concept of the organism for them after having gone through this participatory method. So I've identified these as metamorphosis, which is a kind of that if we're talking about organization in the case of an organism, what we're talking about is this processual organization that's inherently transformative, almost in an epigenetic sense. What I would call kind of a situated drive, so kind of like ecologically embedded drive that organisms robustly create and improvisationally maintain a type of temporal organization in the face of various circumstances. So Goethe has this line that each organism is its own purpose, right? And then something like what I would call dynamic unity, that the functional coherence of an organism in its circumstances, so that functional coherence itself is a subset of a wider repertoire of viable harmonious functions of the organism's parts and powers. That Goethe, for instance, talks about the fact that, the fact that a plant in a way can adapt and improvise because it's modular. It has these different component parts that can do multiple things. They're not necessarily tied to one fate. It depends on where the organism is, how it's growing, and the conditions of its growth and transformation. So even these kind of pure phenomena that one might derive or one might kind of cognize from encounters with numerous organisms ought to be understood then also as being ecological and historical. Ecological in the sense that the organisms and even these kind of concepts, these pure concepts of organisms, are organisms that are traversing, their worlds, their Umwelten, the places in which and the conditions of their own existence. So these forms that one has in mind, in a way, also kind of uh, presuppose an environment in which these organisms are navigating. And in that way, they're also historical, right? Because those are going to be conditioned by, in a way, the contingencies of where that organism happens to be, and also the conditions in which the observer happens to have observed all those organisms. Um, so briefly taking stock, the next two sections are a lot shorter, so I think we're doing fine on time. Um, so Goethe's genealogical method is kind of purpose-built to account for the active productivity of nature, as well as to counteract and mitigate epistemic impatience. Disciplined perception transforms the scientist in Goethe's reading, allowing the scientist to intuit and, in again, a way to dance, to sync with nature. And the seriality and order that one uses in the genetic or the genealogical method allows the investigator to reproduce phenomena in their own mind and also to communally correct and purify those phenomena in conversation with the scientific community. So with that said, then, we'll move on to representing life. So Goethe identifies in his communication, his talking about life and how he wants to talk about life, a number of inadequacies. I'm just going to say the inadequacies of images. In the case of Linnaeus, Goethe learns a lot from Linnaeus. Linnaeus's botany, and studies it a ton as a young man, but becomes frustrated with the fact that the entire kind of binomial nomenclature system is he finds it just annoying to kind of reduce an organism to just a little name, and hard to remember all these names if one has never had encounters with these organisms. There's an obsession with kind of the type specimen, right, of these kind of mature, reproductively mature adult versions of the organisms, as though those static forms of the adult is the totality of the organism itself, as being like completely representative of the life form of the organism. So he sees these kinds of and the prevalence of the Linnaean system and the people who are doing natural history and kind of filling it out as simply being inadequate to represent the fullness of life. I'll just put it that way for now. In the case of words, which you've kind of touched on already, Goethe says, neither things nor ourselves find full expression in our words. We get by in life with our everyday language, for we describe only superficial relationships. And in Goethe's poem, The Metamorphosis of Plants, which he wrote after he wrote his kind of scientific treatise on the metamorphosis of plants, near the end of the poem, he kind of almost expresses that Linnaean frustration, and says something that I think is rather revelatory about how he thinks about words. And this is unfortunately an English translation, so forgive me. Overwhelming, beloved, you find all this mixture of thousands, riot of flowers let loose over the garden's expanse. Many names you take in, and always the last to be spoken drives out the one heard before, barbarous boast to your ear. All the shapes are akin, and none is quite like the other. So to a secret law, surely that chorus must point, to a sacred enigma. Dear friend, how I wish I were able all at once to pass on, happy, the word that unlocks. So there's this desire that to be able to just give someone a word and be like, here it is. This is the answer. This is what the organism is. And of course, he doesn't offer that in the poem, nor does he offer it in the Metamorphosis of Plants. And we'll get to what he does offer instead. But there's this there's a desire that words can have that kind of power, and I think a real reckoning with and the inadequacy of words, that they don't do it very often, and in a way they can't do what Goethe wants them to do. And in the case of images, a very famous story of Goethe's encounter with Schiller, that they start talking about the metamorphosis of plants or botany, and Goethe goes to draw something, and Schiller says, that's not an observation or experience, that's an idea. And then Goethe says, taken aback and somewhat annoyed, I paused and replied, then I may rejoice that I have ideas without knowing it and can even see them with my own eyes. But the idea is that, and he speaks about we see kind of examples of this in some of Goethe's other works. There's these attempts to Goethe reckons with and explicitly talks about how a single image just does not do the organism justice and cannot actually give the fullest account or the fullest comprehension of what it is that the organism is. And then we see attempts to, in a way, in one image, in one fell swoop, visualize every possible metamorphosis of the plant. So this plant obviously doesn't exist, but it's an attempt by Turpin to put every single possible variation of the plant and its roots into one plant and say, oh, that's the Urpflanze, that's the archetypal plant. And Goethe did not, like, when he was looking at Turpin's work, this was a frontispiece for a version of the Metamorphosis of Plants that was published after Goethe's death. But when Goethe was talking about Turpin, he was talking about, he wrote to him and said, you should keep doing these serial drawings. These are really interesting. They're really good. They get more to what it is that I would hope that would bring people to kind of living understanding of nature. So these are all inadequate in their capacity to reproduce or represent the concept of the organism in the mind of another. One says the word, one shows the picture, and one does not cognize that kind of like fuller concept of the organism that one might have through the genetic method. Now, Goethe, though, was an expert in writing motion. Poems, novels, plays, music, they all unfold in time through recitation, through reading, through performance. They require the attention of the audience for the duration of that time to grasp the full form of the artwork. And they are themselves, in a way, time forms. So last night, thank you, Luke and Hung Yu. I mean, it was a great way to kind of experience that firsthand and prepare for this talk, right? Just thinking through, like, one had to listen to the fullness of that poem from any of the poems from beginning to end to kind of actually take in the poem. And so to be able to experience that together, I think was really helpful in this way. So Goethe did those things all the time, right? This is what he was in a way known the best for. The fact that he was a dramatist, a poet, a novelist. He was adept at writing motion, using narrative to tell stories, temporal stories that unfolded in time, that demanded that his audiences spend that time with them. So we actually see a little bit of this in his scientific writings as well. His treatise on the metamorphosis of plants actually has a few sections that goes stepwise and kind of demonstrates in writing and prose the transformations of an organism in time. There's also sections in the theory of colors where he does a similar thing for experimental setups, right? Where he kind of walks you through what you ought to do in a certain experimental setup to replicate a certain set of phenomena for oneself. But you need to go through that process. You need to listen to the instructions, go through it with him. And I already mentioned read a piece of the Metamorphosis of Plants. So it's a poem that he writes on the Metamorphosis of Plants. And in a way, the poem and in a way, the treatise are better representations of the Urpflanze, or like the actual Bildung of a plant, than an image could be, or that, because it also has this dimension of time. So I'm going to have to move relatively quickly through this piece. But this is a little bit of an experiment. When you know a time form, when you've cognized it, when you've taken it in, there's an interesting thing that happens with fragments and with those singular images and with Gestalten, right? So in the case of temporal arts, and forgive me, these are kind of just, I think, hopefully readily knowable. When one sees that quote, to be or not to be, that is the question. For those of us who are familiar with Hamlet, does it not evoke not only that soliloquy, but the entirety of the play, right? So if one already has the experience of that thing and the concept kind of in a way living within one's memory and imagination, suddenly then the image does the work that Goethe wants it to do, but it's premised on the fact that one has already cognized the time form. How about da 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 da? Right? How about once upon a midnight jury while I pondered weak and weary, right? Poe's Raven. Someone sees this image, hopefully the Phantom of the Opera, and everything about that comes immediately to mind. And maybe an example in cinema, right? I mean, if you see Luke Skywalker yelling no, if you've seen the movie, you don't understand the significance of this image at all if one has not already experienced, The Empire Strikes Back, but one knows it in that context. And even in super abstract representation, this is all of Star Wars, by the way, episodes 1 through 9, in just frames compressed into images. If one knows the story, one can go up to that and say, "Oh, I know. This is the Battle of Hoth," because that's all snow, and those are all ATSTs and whatever. So just a kind of fun experimental example. But the same thing is true when we look at individual Gestalten, if we've already kind of cognized the uh, the the full time forms of these things. So even in the case of a trace of an animal, seeing this footprint in the sand, if one knows, the kind of the way of life of red fox, Vulpes vulpes, then one can identify that and connect it to it. It also makes probably, in a way cognizable, understandable for this time, something like a corpse. The corpse of a red fox, if you encounter that in nature, it doesn't even make sense unless you connect it to the time form of the red fox. That object that you find in the forest, this dead thing, only makes sense if you can throw it back into that context imaginatively. So for those intimately familiar with time forms in nature and art, an image, a trace, a musical phrase, or a word can evoke a representation of the entirety of that time form. So in a way, this is a form of a synecdoche, a figure of speech in which a part is made to represent the whole. So the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, you only really get that if you know that we're not talking about just a pen and a sword, right? It's evoking the rest of the kind of metaphorical world around it. So otherwise inadequate representations can summon temporal phenomena in the minds of those who cognize them. So in a way, it's a way to kind of uh, to rehabilitate images and visual representations. Goethe does say how difficult it is, though, to refrain from replacing the thing with its sign, to keep the object alive before us instead of killing it with the word. Now, this is a pretty long quote, but I think it is worth reading in full. And the last piece I can rip through really quickly because it is kind of a direction. So Goethe says, in his preface to his theory of light, a good play is only half present in a written text. The greater portion of it draws on the glitter of the stage, the personality of the actor, the power of his voice, the distinctiveness of his gestures, even the intelligence and favorable mood of the audience. This applies all the more to a work on natural phenomena. If the reader is to enjoy and make use of it, he must actually have nature before him, either in fact or in the activity of the imagination. It should be as though the writer were speaking in person. Her text should be as directly visible, a directly visible demonstration of the phenomena as they occur naturally or artificially. Then all her commentary, clarification, and interpretation will succeed in creating the effect of life. The plates, so the static images that he has in his theory of colors, which often accompany such treatises, offer an inadequate surrogate for this. An ongoing physical phenomena, its forces radiating in every direction, cannot be contained in line drawing or indicated by a cross section. No one would dream of explaining chemical experiments with diagrams, yet similar experiments in physics are often explained in this way, for such diagrams have certain uses. Frequently, however, these diagrams depict only concepts. They work as symbolic aids, hieroglyphic models of communication, which gradually replace the phenomena, replace nature itself, and become more a hindrance than a help in the pursuit of true knowledge. We too have found it necessary to include such plates. We have tried to arrange them so that the reader may feel confident in finding didactic and polemical applications of them. So here we see, in a way, a synthesis of this last section, right? It's Goethe's kind of reckoning with the limitations of visual and verbal and poetic means of representing life, but showing kind of a way beyond them, a way to make them useful. And it's precisely in this vein that I'm just going to gesture at the connection between Goethe and cinema. Um, so, is this? I think I could do it in a minute.
2 moments.
Thank you. Is picturing, like visualizing the drama of life, like just a technical limitation though? Can we visually show time forms in action? We have attempts to do this. And it was a technical limitation in Goethe's lifetime. Um, but Goethe's inspired checkmate. So this is a very famous Czech scientist, Jan Evangelista Purkinje. And he knew Goethe, read his work, read Schelling, read Fichte, sent his dissertation on the physiology of the eye to Goethe. Goethe read it, loved it, reviewed it, and they exchanged letters until the end of their life. So he was very familiar with Goethe's work. Goethe was familiar with his own. And in 1832, the stroboscope was created, the spinning image that uses a stroboscopic effect to demonstrate a kind of movement. And in 1840, Purkinje actually created a version of it that I apparently can't show you in motion, but I could put it on when we ask questions. And basically, what he ends up doing is using the kinetoscope in teaching. He uses it to demonstrate physiological effects, the beating of the heart, the movement of newts, the gait of certain objects. So we actually have in the just subsequent to and in a way inspired by Goethe's own notion of seriality, ordering, Gestalten in a certain order, the creation of a technical means of actually demonstrating, creating visual time forms from which biologists could then learn and teach about the movements and motions in nature. So last slide, I promise. For Goethe, cognizing organismal phenomena requires accompanying them through their temporal metamorphoses. Using various artistic time forms, Goethe experimented in writing organisms' motion. So with the intention of replicating that motion in his audience's imaginations or guiding them to undertake their own patient observations. The influence of Goethe on Purkinje and the overcoming of certain challenges of representation afforded by the technical advances at the dawn of cinema and animation warrant further research. So that's why I think that Goethe could be called a proto-cinematographer. So there we are. Thank you. Thanks for your